Now hear the word of the Lord from Hebrews 10:26 through 39. Dear friends, if we deliberately continue sinning after we have received knowledge of the truth, there is no longer any sacrifice that will cover these sins. There is only the terrible expectation of God's judgment and the raging fire that will consume his enemies. For anyone who refused to obey the law of Moses was put to death without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Just think about how much worse the punishment will be for those who have trampled on the Son of God and have treated the blood of the covenant, which made us holy, as if it were common and unholy, and have insulted and disdained the Holy Spirit who brings God's mercy to us. For we know the one who said, "I will take revenge, I will pay them back." He also said, "The Lord will judge his own people." It is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Think back on those early days when you first learned about Christ. Remember how you remained faithful even though it meant terrible suffering. Sometimes you were exposed to public ridicule and were beaten, and sometimes you helped others who were suffering the same things. You suffered along with those who were thrown into jail, and when all you owned was taken from you, you accepted it with joy. You knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. So do not throw away this confident trust in the Lord. Remember the great reward it brings you. Patient endurance is what you need now so that you will continue to do God's will. Then you will receive all that he has promised. For in just a little while the coming one will come and not delay, and my righteous ones will live by faith. But I will take no pleasure in anyone who turns away. But we are not like those who run away from God to their own destruction. We are the faithful ones whose souls will be saved. Thanks be to God.
Amen. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Good morning, Sojourn. Peace be with you. It's good to see you. Good to be with you. My name's Jonah, and I'm one of the pastors here at Sojourn. If you're visiting with us, welcome. Our mission as a church is to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ, build one another up as his church, and send one another to follow him as instruments of truth, beauty, and goodness. So thank you for being a part of that. Real quick, we have a members meeting tonight at 6:30. Lest you members have forgotten, we'll be continuing our conversation around our partnership with the Southern Baptist Convention, so it's relatively significant. I hope you can make it. It'll be in this room at 6:30 p.m. There's no real easy way to say some of the stuff that I want to say, so I guess I'll just say it. As has already been mentioned in the service, it was just been a very difficult week. It's weighed heavily on me. The shooting in Nashville weighed heavily on me. And things change when tragedy stops being abstract and it becomes real. I echo all that was prayed a few moments ago for the many affected by this week's shootings. If you were with us on Easter last week, you may recall at one point in the sermon, I said, I want to hope that this is the last school shooting. And we wake up the next day to a mass shooting and a school shooting. And I'm left wondering why. Why does this happen here? And it doesn't seem to happen other places. Why did this shooter do what he did? I talked with a friend who lives in Louisville on Monday afternoon, and I left that conversation wondering why none of us heard about the shooting that had happened the week before in West Louisville that took the lives of little ones. I keep asking why the issue of guns in America has become so polarizing and so contentious. My heart's been racing for 5 days knowing I had to say something this morning about it. Why is that? I feel very strongly that it's not a pastor's job to tell you who to vote for or to tell you what to vote. And yet we live in a country where we have a voice and we have a choice. I don't want to tell anyone who to vote for or what to vote for, and some of that is because I don't really know what to vote for or who to vote for. It's been a while since I tried to offend everybody in a room at one time, but I'm going to try. And again, I preface all this with I'm a bit of a mess, and I'm not exactly excited about any of this right now. I'm just really troubled by what's going on in the far left political areas of our country. I think the far left, or maybe the left in general, is rightly concerned about issues of intolerance and bigotry. I think those are things that Christians in the church should be concerned about and should pay attention to. But I'm just bewildered and confused how the left thinks that the right way to handle intolerance and bigotry is by embracing intolerance and bigotry towards other groups instead. So it's like, okay, let's move to the right. And then I look at the far right, and I think the right is rightly concerned about government overreach, making the government too powerful and too big, putting too much power in a small group of people. I think the church should be wary of that, and we should be concerned about it. But I'm just bewildered, I'm baffled beyond words how the right thinks that we'll deal with government overreach by embracing fascism and authoritarianism. So who do we vote for? What do we do? I think the thing maybe I'm most troubled by is how there's this unseen and unheard reasonable middle ground that doesn't get any attention in our country. The far extremes on both sides have dominated the conversation, and they're the loudest voices, and they're the ones who get to decide how the conversation goes. And so we gather here as the church in this middle ground, so to speak, and we confess, like the psalmist does, our trust is not in horses or chariots, but our trust is in the Lord. So what does that mean? Oh, sounds great. What does it mean? We'll talk about this in great detail next week as we get into Hebrews chapter 11. There are ditches in the life of faith that go to the left and that go to the right. And depending on which ditch is your favorite ditch, you tend to hurl insults at the people who go into the other ditch. And then we can just sit there and fight one another the whole time. Faith, which is all we're talking about next Sunday, has both an inward expression and an outward expression. Faith is an inward confidence of certain realities that produces external action. And so we can't be content to just have ideas or to just have action. The life of faith is a life where we figure out how both of these live together. From the beginning at Sojourn, we have said that our best church program is our people living as Christians. So my job isn't to tell you who to vote for, but as a pastor, one of our responsibilities is to try to help us think as Christians about very complicated issues. Not as Republicans or Democrats. How do Christians view this thing? We want to think about these things Christianly. We want to be deeply formed people. So after the Nashville shooting, which just deeply disturbed me and for a number of reasons, I read a book called When Thoughts and Prayers Are Not Enough. When thoughts and prayers are not enough. And unless that title troubles you, I want to be very clear. We are a praying people. Our first and ongoing response to sufferings, tragedy, uncertainty is always going to be prayer. We are not going to stop praying, and I don't want to in any way let the title of that book make you think that we're minimizing the life of prayer. Praying is a necessity, and we are a praying people. Deep faith and deep prayer will lead us to action, though. It'll change the way we view the world, and it'll change the way we enact with the world. And with an issue like guns in the United States, it's very complicated. It's just very complicated, and it's a long-standing issue. So I don't want to tell you what to think about it or what to do about it, but I'm pleading with you. If you have 2% concern or interest on the issue of gun violence in America, I plead with you to read this book. It's written by a sister in Christ who survived a school shooting. The first chunk of it is her story of what happened, her recovery after being shot. The second section has to deal with how it affected her faith through doubt and suffering and confusion and uncertainty. How did this shape her faith? And then the final section, she talks about things that we can do about it. And it's not abstract. She brings her receipts, as it were. She talks about laws that have worked other places that honor our traditions, our culture's history with guns, and the reality of where we are as a society that's becoming increasingly violent. And so she doesn't say we have to do all of these things. She says these are things that have worked, and they're things that we can educate ourselves on so that we can exercise our voice in a more Christian way around a very complicated issue. Because listen, I know the one side wants to say, let's just take all of the guns. That's you could put a number of labels on that idea. At the very least, it's unrealistic. It's not possible. And as the church, we should look at that and say, but the people wielding these guns have twisted, sinful hearts. They'll find another way, right? The idea of taking all of the guns and that solving the problem is a simplistic solution that won't work. On the opposite side, to say, let everybody have all of the guns is ludicrous because we're putting these weapons in the hands of sinful people with twisted hearts. If we try to go to just one or the other, both of these solutions will be simplistic and unrealistic. And as the church, one thing that we have to grow in is not settling for simplistic solutions to very complicated problems. We have to become a people who can address these issues with the complexity necessary. Thoughts, yes. Prayers, absolutely. And action. And so I plead with you to read it. When thoughts and prayers are not enough, rent it from the library. I listened to it on audiobook because you can hear some of the heartache in this woman's story. We have to understand the complexity, learn what has worked in other places, and then we as the church can make our voice heard. We just can't remain silent on it anymore. And I think it's worth emphasizing that any change that will happen around this issue will be very slow. And I wish I could say it's not going to happen again. We'll get the changes done in time before it happens again. That's probably not the case. And so what do we do as the church while we're waiting for change? What do we do while we face the reality of suffering today? You can have all kinds of plans for how you're going to deal with the uncertainty, but that doesn't change the fact that many of us are suffering today. Many of us have shed tears today. Suffering is an unavoidable part of life. It's unavoidable. And have you ever noticed how suffering will even be involved in the joyous parts of life or the supposedly happy parts of life? Having kids is a great example. It took my wife and I several years to get pregnant with our first, Booker. It's not funny for any of you, but it's funny for me. My kids were in the front row in the first service, and they were losing their minds for 40 minutes. Like it stopped the service. We had to usher them out. That was kind of funny. I thought they'd be excited to hear about themselves, but they weren't. I went to every OB appointment with my wife because I was committed to being a good husband. And everything was going great. Everything was fine. I had an opportunity to work on a book, which I was like, this is going to change the world. This is going to be amazing. And so my wife said, yeah, you can miss the last appointment. It's just a checkup, no big deal. I was an hour away when I got a phone call, and my wife was sobbing on the phone. And if you know my wife, that's not her vibe. She went in for an appointment, had high blood pressure. Doctor said she had preeclampsia, and they had to induce immediately. She called me while she's being wheeled. You know, up on State Street, she's being wheeled across the bridge into the delivery room. And I'm like, okay, and I'm going 100 miles an hour in my 1985 Toyota Land Cruiser. I didn't have that at the time. What was I driving? It doesn't matter. Probably a Honda. Rest in peace. I totaled that thing. So I'm flying 100 miles an hour to get to the hospital. I called my mom because they wanted to know to meet the baby. And in my mind, what I said was, hey, we're about to have the baby. You guys should come. And what came out was sobs of, I missed it. I missed it. I missed it. And so I fly to the hospital, and I'm 2 minutes from the hospital, and my wife calls me, and I'm expecting to hear a baby crying. And she says, they gave me a bag of fluids, and my blood pressure went down, and so I can go home, still pregnant. Went home, I preached the next Sunday, and a few hours later, we met Booker. And I can play it like a movie in my mind. I remember the instant sobs when all of a sudden this belly turns into a human, like the instant sobs. And I remember all of the cliches and coming out into the waiting room to strangers and being like, it's a boy, this is what a baby boy looks like, as if they had never seen one, It's so vivid in my mind. I remember how brave and steady Allison was. The whole thing was magical. I remember the long recovery afterwards, calling the doctors in the middle of the night, being like, is this normal? This just happened. Is this normal? He did this. Is this normal? Freaking out. and obviously the joys of this little one. 15 months later, Cora was born on Ash Wednesday. I remember we were watching, I preached Ash Wednesday, there was a huge snowstorm. I drove through the snow, got to the hospital, and we were watching HGTV. I remember watching it vividly. I remember when the nurse came in to check on her, and instead of checking on her, she shouted, "I see a head, doctor!" And we were like, "What? A head?" And we went from watching HGTV to holding a baby in about 2 minutes. I remember Cora's struggles with jaundice and colic. I remember the suitcase of lights we had to put her in and how much she hated it. I remember how tired we were for months afterwards, 2 under 15. Booker was born on a Sunday. Cora was born on a Wednesday. Salem was born on a January. I just don't really remember much about Salem being born. And I talked to my wife about this, and she doesn't remember either. Mostly, I remember how delighted we were to have him. Booker was born with a hole in his heart. That was really scary. At 12 weeks, scans showed that Cora had multiple cysts on her brain. That was really scary. Salem was born with signs of tethered cord and spina bifida. That was really scary. Each pregnancy and birth was scary and brought some amount of suffering with it. Each pregnancy and birth, though, was less scary than the one before that. It's not because any of the issues were less scary. The events leading to the joy of these little ones became foggier with each child. The suffering and the pain and the uncertainty became foggier and foggier with each child, and they become foggier and foggier as the years go by. And maybe that's because I'm the dad. Maybe all the moms in here hate me right now. Maybe it's because we were tired that the details became foggier and foggier. Maybe that's the case. But I think we became acquainted with one of the truest patterns of life as humans. Suffering comes before joy. To put that in the language of the scriptures, crucifixion comes before resurrection. As we just celebrated, Good Friday always comes before Easter. There is no road to the joy of Easter without entering into the darkness and suffering of Good Friday. The text this morning, we didn't plan any of this. We planned this series in Hebrews over a year ago. And so it falls on this morning. And it's a scary text, and it's a text about suffering. But the point of this text is not to scare us or discourage us. It's to equip us to learn how to suffer like Christians, how to suffer well. As is so often the case in Hebrews, the preacher begins with, "Dear friends." The context is a loving relationship. He's giving these words to people he cares a great deal about. And he says to them, if we deliberately continue sinning after we have received knowledge of the truth, there's no longer any sacrifice that will cover these sins. Maybe you've read this verse before and been like, I have sinned after becoming a Christian. And then you're terrified. The preacher has in mind here a very specific sin called apostasy. Apostasy is what he's talking about. This is the deliberate rejection of Jesus as the great high priest who died for our sins once for all. When folks get baptized here, we say, what is your sacred confession? And they cry out, Jesus is Lord. To commit apostasy is to say, Jesus is not Lord. The preacher describes apostasy as trampling the Son of God, treating his most precious blood that makes us holy as if it was common, as if it was profane. It's an insult to the Holy Spirit. Very intense language. And if you've been around the church long enough, you've seen this happen. You've seen people commit apostasy. It's painful to watch, and we often respond poorly to it because of how painful and discouraging it is for us. We spend so much time wondering or concerning ourselves with how do we respond to the person that commits apostasy, or as we in the church say, we hand them over to Satan. And listen to how the scriptures say we respond here. This is God speaking in Hebrews chapter 10. I will take revenge. I will pay them back. He also said, the Lord will judge his own people. Apostasy is God's department, not ours. Or put it a little bit crudely, you and I are in sales, not in management. People love asking questions like, well, do you think they're going to hell now? And it's like, hey, that is just not our decision. That's above our pay grade. Ours is not to condemn or to critique. Here's top 3 scariest verses in the Bible for me. Verse 31. It's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. When someone commits apostasy, they've fallen into the hands of the living God. And what do? We leave them there. And let the Lord handle this, sort it out, payback, revenge, judgment, whatever the Lord sees fit to deal with that person. That's God's decision. Earlier in the series, we said that a life worth living is a life immersed in the people of God. Part of being immersed in the people of God is learning, what do we do with apostasy? Ours is not to critique and condemn other folks, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider, how do we guard against it? How do we stop it from ever happening? How do we guard our own hearts from falling into this? The doorway to apostasy, I believe this so strongly, and I think the text bears this out. It's not about doctrine and Bible study. The hinge of the doorway of apostasy swings on the issue of suffering. And so when he gives us this warning about apostasy here, he says, leave them to the hands of God. And then he talks to us who remain about pain and about suffering. He says in verse 32, think back on those early days when you first learned about Christ. Remember how you remained faithful, even though it meant terrible suffering. So he says it's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God when these people do this. Now remember how you suffered when it was early on. He talks about public ridicule, beatings, imprisonment, and theft. He's talking about suffering. And in all of my years being in the church, every single time somebody has committed apostasy or walked away from the faith, it's been as a result of suffering. I've never had someone come up to me and say, I'm really struggling whether or not to trust the Bible because all of these promises keep coming true. Or like, my prayer life is really wilting because God keeps answering my prayers. That's never the case. It's always around the issue of suffering. So I wish I could be a physicist, but I'm bad at math. So I made a math equation with words, because that's what I can do to try to help us understand what's going on here. So first, suffering plus isolation equals doubt. The first move of suffering for all of us is to pull away. And you know this, right? Something terrible has happened, a tragedy happens, and you just find yourself wanting to shorten your circle. I want to talk to fewer people. I want to pull away and isolate. When we are suffering and we're isolated, that produces doubt. And listen, I don't know if you've ever heard this. Doubt is not a sin. It's not a sin to doubt or struggle or to ask questions. But suffering plus isolation will lead us to doubt. If the suffering continues and we keep doubting, that equals despair. Suffering plus doubt equals despair. And despair is when hope feels lost, when all is dark and foggy and you're just wondering, is it even worth it at all? If the suffering continues while despair takes root in our heart, that produces apostasy. The pain is so great. Hope feels lost. I'm leaving. I'm not doing this anymore. A life worth living is a life immersed in the people of God. Tragedies like what we have suffered this week will tempt all of us in our own ways to isolate. And in our isolation, we will begin to doubt. And in our isolation and doubt, we will begin to experience despair. There's such danger in our suffering. Not just the pain of what we're enduring, but what that pain can produce in us if we don't know how to suffer well. We must be on guard for our temptation to isolate, to doubt and isolate. It's just not wrong to doubt, but it's a disaster to doubt alone. Look at verse 34. He says to these people he loves, you suffered along with them. You knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. All the yous here in the second half of Hebrews chapter 10, it's plural. He's saying, you guys, dear brothers and sisters, they suffered together. They could feel its effects together. It was the community's pain, not an individual's pain. Or maybe to put that differently, an individual's pain was felt by the entire community. The invitation for us is to immerse ourselves in God's people to such a degree that we experience one another's suffering. It's not an abstract out there concept. We feel it with one another. And listen to the power of presence in our sufferings. Verse 35 says, patient endurance is what you need now so that you will continue to do God's will. Isn't that amazing? Complex explanations. I don't know what you think you need to do in the midst of suffering. The preacher here is saying patience and endurance is what you need. And you will not be patient and you will not endure if you are alone. The sufferings of life are endured primarily through the presence of others. First and foremost, the presence of Christ empowers us to suffer well. And maybe you hear me say this kind of stuff all the time now, and you're like, but what are you talking about? Where do I go to the presence of Christ store? Or do I have to go to some old cathedral? How do I find the presence of Christ? There's all kinds of ways to do it. The easiest way, the most concrete way, the simplest way to get into the presence of Christ is to get into the presence of your brothers and sisters. Right now in this room, you are surrounded by the presence of Christ because you are surrounded by people who are filled with the Spirit of Christ. If you want to know where the presence of Christ is to be found, primarily it's going to be found in your brothers and sisters in the church. We need to be with each other in our suffering far more than we need explanations or answers. Ours is not to condemn or to judge, but to show up and to wait together. And there's something very specific we get to do while we are waiting with one another. We don't wish it away, and we don't explain it away, but instead, verse 35 continues. He says, don't throw away this confident trust in the Lord. Remember the great reward it brings you, for in just a little while the coming one will come and not delay. My righteous ones will live by faith, but I will take no pleasure in anyone who turns away. Do you see what he's doing here? He's saying to them, your suffering will lead to your glory. He's pointing them, he's not distracting them from their suffering. He's almost opening a window in their suffering to see, do you see what's happening through this suffering? On the other side of this suffering, there is something beautiful waiting for you. There is a reward that is worth it. Don't let the pain isolate you. Don't doubt alone. Don't give in to despair. These are the things he's saying. You know what we call that, those kinds of words? We call it encouragement. We call it encouragement. It's saying, hold on, brother. Hold on, sister. It will be worth it. I'm here with you. You're not alone. Hold on. It will be worth it. Don't forget what's coming on the other side of this for you. We show up for each other. We patiently, repeatedly bring encouragement to one another. Suffer well, my brother. Joy comes in the morning. Die well, sister. Your resurrection is coming soon. So on the flip side, I got an equation for suffering well. First, suffering plus patience. Suffering plus presence equals patience. While I'm suffering, I enter into the presence of others. I immerse myself in the lives of others, and that strengthens me and gives me patience amidst all this uncertainty. Suffering plus patience equals endurance. When I'm with my brothers and sisters, I can hold on. I can stay. And if we endure, even in the midst of great suffering, suffering plus endurance equals eternal joy. When you're a scared new parent, older parents brought you reassurance, right? Can you remember that? I remember when we had Cora, and I didn't sleep for what felt like 4 years. It was really like 2 weeks. I remember our first Sunday coming to church thinking I was going to die. I was just so tired and overwhelmed. I don't know if they're... I saw the Quillos walk in with 3 children, and they were happy and smiling. And I was like, this Quillo survived. This is survivable. And I was so encouraged just by seeing that these people didn't die because of how tired they were. The pain and uncertainty of pregnancy is worth it because of the reward, right? This is a parable, a living parable of our shared lives with Christ. The suffering is worth it because of the great reward waiting for us. By the third child, we were not so scared because we had gone through it before and we knew the joy waiting for us. When we suffer together, those who have gone before us are able to say, this is what's waiting for you. This is how we got through this, or even just, I'm here with you. When we suffer together, we learn we are not alone. We're not the only one who has ever faced this pain or this loss or committed this mistake. If you want to suffer well, you have to suffer together. Suffering together requires endurance. Endurance requires us to become an encouraging people. And if we suffer together, and if we endure, if we encourage, it will lead to our great reward. So, one question that I leave you with, and maybe this is something just for you to carry through your week. How would we suffer today if we knew our resurrection was tomorrow? How would you suffer now, knowing the golden city that's waiting for you tomorrow? How would we suffer today if we knew our resurrection was tomorrow? Hold on, Christian. Hold on. Suffering always comes before glory. Good Friday always comes before Easter. Crucifixion always comes before resurrection. Hold on. For as the preacher said, we are not like those who turn away from God. Amen? We are not like those who turn away from God to their own destruction. We are the faithful ones whose souls will be saved. Thanks be to God. If you're willing and able, please stand with me and we'll pray.